a lot of it was very subjective. And once they decided that you were, if they suspected that you, say, didn't basically like Maoris, or you didn't believe all their little fairy tales they were telling you, you'd sort of basically figuratively get a black mark against your name, and that you'd find that you just didn't do very well.
Like Peter Adams, Metro magazine writer Carol du Château was not at all surprised when the Anna Penn case hit the headlines. In the June 1992 issue of Metro, she'd written a lengthy feature on how, as Metro put it, the Treaty of Waitangi Crusaders had taken over nursing education. In the course of preparing the article, Carol du Château became concerned that cultural safety was being promoted at the expense of normal clinical competence.
I did feel the standard of nursing, clinical nursing, was going down. There were several people who stood up and said that. And one of the reasons that's possible is because 20% of the curriculum was supposed to be being given over to cultural safety, which is marae visits, so on and so forth. Then, about 3/4 of the way through my research, I found that actually, even though 20% of the course was marked on cultural safety, in fact, only something like 8% of course time was given over to cultural safety study. I think the clinical standards in nursing are part of a wider thing than just cultural safety, but I do think clinical standards have dropped.
As you have professionals whom you quote in your article saying, look, there are nurses coming out who don't even know what to do with a catheter.
True.
And that's literally true.
And that is literally true, yes.
And you think that's because they're spending time doing cultural safety courses?
Well, I actually went and sat in on a course at Carrington Polytech, in the nursing school there, and I just went off the top, without really making much of an appointment, and went to whatever class happened to be on at the time, and they spent their entire time talking about racism and I think it was mostly racism and how you really dealt with people from a psychological point of view. There was absolutely nothing to do with injections or what drugs were worth what and so on and so forth.
Metro magazine writer Carol du Château. Reacting to the controversy stirred by the Anna Penn affair, the Nursing Council, the seemingly non-accountable body in charge of the state nursing curriculum, has reiterated that the cultural safety component of the state nursing exam will remain at 20%. Nurses Society National Director David Wills believes there's a not-so-secret agenda to raise both the course and exam content to 50%. Even at current levels, he says, cultural safety has already claimed several victims.
We've had about a dozen so far since the cultural safety thing came in as a requirement in the exam, and that's only in the last 18 months, because although there's been, and rightly so to some extent, but although there's been a cultural component in the nursing course for years now, the cultural safety thing is new. We've had about 10 cases where students have approached us who are having problems, who for one reason or another didn't want to participate or felt unable to participate in something, or were at risk of being failed and have been counselled because of being allegedly culturally unsafe. The typical example would be a second-year student, who was initially failed by their nursing lecturers as being culturally unsafe because that student declined to attend a potpourri. That student, and this wasn't a Maori and New Zealand Society course, it was a psychiatric course that they were failed by, so it was the lecturers and the mental health component that failed them as being culturally unsafe. Now, that student was failed because they declined to go to a potpourri that was put on by a Maori health unit. The student had carefully studied the nature of the potpourri and had decided that it involved acknowledging other gods, that it was a spiritual ceremony, and that particular student had a strong Christian belief that believed in one God and that you shouldn't worship other gods or acknowledge other gods. So that student asked the Maori unit could they be excused from attending the potpourri. The Maori unit was quite happy with doing that, no problem at all. But they were subsequently failed by the lecturers as being culturally unsafe because of their inability to attend the potpourri. Now, there were the student brought us in, we had meetings with the lecturers concerned, and it was very clear from me from day one that we were dealing with people that were totally unwilling to compromise, that they were completely inflexible, and we had extreme difficulties. For instance, I suggested as a compromise that we seek the advice of the Maori Health Unit concerned, and that if they didn't take exception to the student not attending the POFRI, then that should be the end of the matter. We were told by the lecturers that no, that was unacceptable because those particular Maoris were not politically correct, that they didn't understand the full political implications of the student's behaviour, and therefore it would be inappropriate. When we suggested they take advice of Kaumatua on the subject, we were told that that would be incorrect too, because to ask Maori's advice was to invite them to have to compromise, and that Maoris had had to do that for New Zealand's entire history, so we could never seek the advice of Maoris on the subject. Now, to me, it seemed extremely patronising, extremely arrogant that Pākehā nursing lecturers were taking this stance, but nonetheless that was the stance that they had.
Because these were Pākehā?
Oh, these were Pākehā lecturers.
Who exactly? In what positions? Who are these people?
These were senior nursing lecturers in one of the polytechs who completely controlled one part of the nursing course, and that student was failed by them as being culturally unsafe. Now, it happens that further along the line, and with advocacy by us and others, that their decision was subsequently overturned. But we can't be sure that that's always going to happen, and even if we are going to be successful in all cases, it's a lot of work for us and it's a lot of problems for the particular students.
Is it causing nursing standards to be compromised?
Medical
standards.
In some ways it is, because if you devote 20% of the exam to cultural safety, that's 20% of the question. By implication, you can't have questions on other areas. And in theory, anyhow, if you're going to devote 20% of an exam to a particular aspect of nursing, then you have to have 20% of the curriculum devoted to that. We haven't quite got that, but there is no doubt that cultural safety subjects and time is at the expense of other areas of the curriculum, and we're already weak in some areas now, and we fear that partly because of this and partly because of other things, we have practitioners now who will be culturally correct but not very good nurses.
Well, how readily then could a nurse from New Zealand get a job overseas, for example, trained in cultural safety?
The cultural safety thing is almost completely irrelevant overseas. We have great difficulty. Because of the high level of unemployment amongst nurses here, the big surplus, we have a lot of New Zealand nurses that have to go overseas. We're more involved than anyone else with that. We're also more involved than any other agency or organisation in New Zealand with dealing with new graduates. So we know what they're thinking, we know what their problems are, and we know how they're prepared. They can't easily pass overseas licensure exams without having to do a lot of intensive additional study. For instance, we've got unemployed New Zealand nurses and new graduates going to the United States. They're having to do months of study covering areas that should have been in the curriculum in order to prepare them for those exams so that they can be successful.
National Director of the New Zealand Nurses Society, David Wills.
Person with an alternative body image.
A fat person.
Domestic incarceration survivor.
Housewife.
Personhole.
Manhole.
Orally challenged.
Deaf.
To wombage.
To manage.
Botanical companion.
Pot plant.
Processed animal carcasses.
Meat.
Scorched processed animal carcass.
Well done steak.
Processed tree carcasses.
Books.
Dead white European males.
Great figures from the past, such as Shakespeare, who wrote books.
Earlier, Dr. Bob Mann said he didn't know the historical origins of political correctness. Well, in America, where they've had more time to make sense of this phenomenon, some philosophers believe they do have it sussed. Its theoretical basis lies in the philosophical movement known as postmodernism, which calls into question the very existence of an objective reality and therefore the possibility of objective knowledge. It attacks science, history, and any claim to truth. It upholds the supremacy, as a matter of truth, of primitive, tribal cultures over the individualism of the modern market economy. One influential variant of postmodernism is deconstructivism, which claims, among other things, that literary texts have no inherent meaning